Imagine a kingdom where a tiny few have everything, and the vast majority have almost nothing. This was France in the late 1700s, a place of dazzling palaces and desperate poverty, all existing side by side. The country was divided into three social classes, or estates. The first estate was the clergy, the church officials who owned huge amounts of land but paid hardly any taxes. Then came the second estate, the nobility, who enjoyed lives of immense privilege, held all the top jobs, and were also exempt from paying their fair share. Together, these two groups made up a sliver of the population, but held all the power and wealth, leaving the burden of running the kingdom on everyone else. The vast majority of French people, over 97%, were crammed into the third estate. This group included everyone from poor farmers and city workers to educated doctors and lawyers. Despite their numbers and the essential work they did, they had no voice in how the country was run. They were the ones who paid the heavy taxes that funded the king's lavish lifestyle and expensive wars. Imagine working your fingers to the bone, only to see your hard-earned money taken to pay for another diamond necklace for the queen, or another pointless battle. This deep and grinding inequality created a sea of resentment that was slowly but surely reaching its boiling point. Adding fuel to this fire were some truly terrible ideas about money from the government. King Louis XVI and his predecessors had spent France into a deep financial hole. The American Revolution, which France had supported to get back at its old enemy Britain, was a particularly costly adventure. To make matters worse, a series of bad harvests meant there was not enough bread to go around and prices shot up. For the ordinary person, bread was the main food, and when they couldn't afford a loaf, their families starved. All the while, they heard stories of the king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, living in unimaginable luxury at the Palace of Versailles, seemingly unaware of their people's suffering. And then, new ideas began to spread like wildfire. Philosophers of the Enlightenment were writing about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. They questioned the very idea that a king had a divine right to rule. Across the Atlantic, the Americans had just thrown off the rule of their own king and created a new republic built on these very principles. These stories and ideas gave the French people a new language to express their unhappiness. They began to wonder why they should have to live under an unfair system. They started to believe that they, the people, should be the ones to hold the power. The stage was set for a dramatic and bloody confrontation. By 1789, King Louis XVI was finally forced to admit that France was broke. His solution was to call a meeting of the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from all three estates for the first time in 175 years. He hoped they would approve new taxes, but the third estate had other plans. They arrived in Versailles demanding real change. They wanted a fairer voting system where each representative had one vote, not just one vote per estate, which always allowed the privileged first and second estates to outvote them. When the king and the other estates refused, the third estate took a bold and revolutionary step. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the French people. This was an open challenge to the king's authority. Furious, Louis locked them out of their usual meeting hall, but the representatives would not be silenced. They gathered at a nearby indoor tennis court and took a solemn oath, which we now call the Tennis Court Oath. They swore not to give up until they had written a new constitution for France. This was a pivotal moment. The people were no longer just asking for change, they were demanding it and taking power into their own hands. Rumors began to fly around Paris that the king was gathering his army to crush this new assembly and punish the people for their defiance. Fear and anger gripped the city. On the scorching hot day of July 14th, 1789, the people of Paris decided to fight back. They needed weapons, and they knew just where to find them: the Bastille. This gloomy medieval fortress was used as a state prison, and to the people, it was a terrifying symbol of the king's absolute and cruel power. A huge crowd stormed the fortress, overwhelming the guards in a violent and bloody battle. The fall of the Bastille was more than just a military victory. It was a massive symbolic one. It showed the world that the people were no longer afraid, and that the king could not control them. This event is still celebrated in France every year as their national day. The news from Paris spread like a shockwave across the countryside, sparking what became known as the Great Fear. Peasants, who had suffered for centuries under the heel of their noble landlords, rose up in rebellion. They burned manor houses and destroyed records of their feudal duties, tearing down the old system of control piece by piece. In response, the National Assembly moved quickly to make sweeping changes. In August, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This incredible document declared that all men were born free and equal in rights, including liberty, property, and security. It was the death sentence for the old world of privilege and the birth certificate for a new, more equal France. With the old order in tatters, France tried to create a new one. For a time, it seemed a constitutional monarchy might work, where Louis XVI would remain as king, but with his powers limited by a constitution written by the National Assembly. However, the king was not a willing partner in this new arrangement. In 1791, Louis, along with his wife Marie Antoinette and their children, tried to flee France in disguise. They were caught near the border and dragged back to Paris in disgrace. This escape attempt destroyed any remaining trust the people had in their monarch. To them, it was proof that the king was a traitor who was conspiring with other European kings to crush the revolution. This act of betrayal pushed the revolution into a much more radical and violent phase. The other monarchies of Europe, like Austria and Prussia, were horrified by what was happening in France. They feared that revolutionary ideas might spread to their own countries, so they declared war on France. This external threat, combined with internal enemies and deep suspicion, created an atmosphere of intense paranoia. The call for an end to the monarchy grew louder and louder. In 1792, the monarchy was officially abolished and France was declared a republic. The following year, Louis XVI was put on trial for treason and executed by the guillotine, a new and supposedly humane killing machine. Marie Antoinette would soon follow him to the scaffold. This was the beginning of the most infamous period of the Revolution, the Reign of Terror. A powerful group called the Committee of Public Safety, led by a stern and uncompromising lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, took control of the government. Robespierre believed that the only way to save the revolution was to ruthlessly eliminate all its enemies, both real and imagined. He declared that terror is the order of the day. What followed was a terrifying witch hunt. Revolutionary tribunals were set up, and anyone suspected of being disloyal, from nobles and priests to ordinary people who made a careless comment, could be arrested, given a sham trial, and sent to the guillotine. For over a year, from 1793 to 1794, the blade of the guillotine fell relentlessly. An estimated 40,000 people were executed or died in prison during the terror. It was a time of absolute fear, where no one felt safe. Robespierre, who had once been seen as the incorruptible defender of the revolution, had become a dictator. Eventually, the people and even his own colleagues turned against him. Fearing they would be next on his list, members of the government organized a coup. In July 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and executed, bringing the Reign of Terror to a dramatic and bloody end. France was left exhausted and deeply divided by the bloodshed. After the nightmare of the terror, France desperately needed stability. The government that followed was a weak and corrupt five-man committee known as the Directory. It struggled to deal with continuing wars, economic problems, and political infighting. The French people were tired of the constant chaos and longed for a strong leader who could restore order. This was the perfect moment for a brilliant and hugely ambitious young general to step onto the stage. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He had made a name for himself with a series of stunning military victories, becoming a national hero. The people saw him as the savior France was waiting for. In 1799, Napoleon saw his chance. In a swift and decisive move, he overthrew the Directory in a coup d'etat. He established a new government where he held all the real power, first as first consul and later, in 1804, crowning himself Emperor of the French. It was a remarkable twist of fate. The revolution that had begun to get rid of one absolute monarch had ended with another, even more powerful one. Napoleon brought order and stability back to France. He created a new set of laws, the Napoleonic Code, which enshrined many of the revolution's principles, like equality before the law. But he also crushed political freedom and waged wars across Europe, spreading both revolutionary ideas and French domination. So, what was the final result of this decade of turmoil? The French Revolution completely remade France. It swept away the centuries-old system of monarchy, aristocracy, and feudalism. The idea that a king ruled by God's will was shattered forever. Power was no longer seen as something inherited by a privileged few, but as something that belonged to the nation and its citizens. The church lost its land and political power. The revolution created a new sense of national identity, uniting the French people as citizens of a single nation rather than subjects of a king. These were profound changes that could never be undone, even after Napoleon was defeated and the monarchy was temporarily restored. The impact of the French Revolution stretched far beyond the borders of France, changing the course of world history. The ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity became a powerful rallying cry for oppressed people everywhere. It inspired countless other revolutions and independence movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man served as a model for human rights declarations around the globe. It championed the principles of democracy, individual rights, and the idea that governments should be accountable to the people they govern. Although it descended into terror and ended in empire, the French Revolution unleashed forces that reshaped the modern world in its image.